This is Defender Radio. Defender Radio is brought to you by the Association for the Protection of Fur-Bearing Animals.
It's the week of June 5th, 2017, and this is Michael Howie welcoming you to episode 432 of Defender Radio. We're going to dive into the interview with Dr. Shelley Alexander shortly, but first I wanted to tell you about an amazing opportunity. A generous donor has offered to match all new and increased monthly donations up to $10,000 in the next few weeks. That means if you sign up with the Fur Bears as a monthly donor for as little as $5, your first month's donation will count as $10 for us. And if you're already a monthly donor, an increase of $5 to your ongoing gift will count as $10 for that first month too. Monthly donations help us plan out long-term strategy and respond to crises facing animals, such as those injured through cruel traps, or beaver families who are facing slaughter that we can protect with our in-field solutions. For just the price of a latte once a month, you can make a real difference. Please head to thefurbears.com/monthly to give now. Conversations about coyotes can quickly get controversial, particularly in the media. Are they simply another creature trying to care for their families and live life peacefully, or are they menacing charlatans waiting to pluck away what we love most? If you're listening to this show, chances are you agree with the former, which also happens to be based in fact. But if you read or watch news, or worse, read social media comments, you'll know there's an awful lot of people who believe the latter is true. That's one of the reasons why we need to question the language we use, the way we have conversations, and how we perceive our own and others' experiences with coyotes. At the forefront of these difficult questions is Dr. Shelley Alexander of the University of Calgary. Dr. Alexander has authored, co-authored, and supervised significant studies, including a media content analysis that highlighted the veracity of media bias in reporting on coyote conflict. In a conversation with Defender Radio, Dr. Alexander explored the results of her past studies, discussed the misinterpretation of coyote behavior, and helped us find the questions we must ask that change the conversations we have about coyotes. You and I first met and first started talking when I learned of your media content analysis on coyotes, and it was in the media and looking at how people talk about coyotes and things like that. I think that's really the interesting place to start. I mean, you're obviously an animal lover. At what point did you decide, hey, this is where I want to focus with my academic career?
I think that shift probably didn't happen immediately, but over time, when you're doing research on wildlife, you start to realize more and more that issues that crop up with animals or conflict with wild animals starts with people and how people relate to those animals. And so, I looked at ways that I could start to understand that problem in a different way using different methods. And, that happened over about a 3-year period, I guess, sort of exploring different techniques, including the media content analysis. And, I was also interested at that time in how, society looks at these animals and how we look at things like coyotes differently than a domestic dog, and the role that institutions like media have to play in that perception, and whether or not that perception leads to how, if we treat them negatively as a consequence.
And I think, your study really highlighted that. And I came across it around the same time that I read Giving Voice to the Voiceless, and that's the Journalism Standards for Incorporating Non-Human Animals by Doctors Beckhoff and Packwood-Freeman.
Right.
And this combination of those two kind of papers really, I think, affected how I did my job. Because on one hand, it's sort of the ethical argument being made in Giving Voice, saying, the animals have sentience, they have personalities, they have all of these wants and desires, but we never talk about them. And then on the other side, having your paper, which very clearly illustrates through observation the bias in the media to villainize coyotes. When you started, that paper in particular, did you realize, or how quickly, I should say, did you realize that the results were going to be so obvious?
I don't think I had a prior really understanding of how it would all roll out. I had also read that same paper that you're referring to
Mm-hmm.
around that time, and or maybe more when I was trying to understand the patterns that I was seeing in the media reporting. But also, I forgot to mention that, like you, around the same time, I was reading Beckhoff's book on emotional lives of animals.
Yeah.
And I think I was actually at a point where I was quite frustrated with our inability as ecologists to actually get traction and make change on how animals are treated. And in the preface of that book, I think I was at a point of sort of saying, I don't think I want to do this anymore. And at the preface of that book, Mark Beckhoff states that, those of us who have the knowledge we must communicate. We're the only voices that will speak for these animals. And so it's connected to that, also that giving voice to the voiceless. And so I didn't, the way that when you do media content analysis, and at least the approach I used was called grounded theory approach, where you go in with sort of a blank slate. You have a few ideas of what you're looking for. And I was expecting there would be a lot of things like the use of the word attack and that, or, overuse of those kinds of words. I didn't know until I started doing the research what themes would emerge. And so I think there were some that were really surprising to me, and that the paper you referred to on the responsibility of journalists to portray things appropriately really helped me understand some of that. And one of the points in that paper was about stereotyping species. And I don't think I had thought about the fact that when one coyote behaves in a certain way and then the media responds to that and says, coyotes attack, coyotes do this, coyotes are bad, coyotes are frightening, all coyotes are then stereotyped by the one behavior of one coyote. And so then our reaction to that as a societal level is to treat them all as if they're bad. And it's actually something that you're not allowed to do when you're speaking about, when you're, as a journalist, when you're speaking about people or different groups of people. So that was interesting. And then the other thing that I think popped out that I was quite surprised about was there was a sudden shift where it moved into criminalization of the behavior. So the language shifted into things referring to coyotes as assailants or villains, and they were stealing or murdering. And so it was that shift. I don't think I realized the extent to which the media was actually misportraying the species.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's like the blinking light on the VCR under the TV that some of the younger audience may not understand. But when the clock wasn't set right and you never noticed it, and then you're sitting and watching a movie and you see that blinking red light, and it's all you can see. That's what it was everywhere. Like for me. Yeah. And that was especially the local competition. And I was sitting there going, no, that's not right. And I'd find their witness and call that witness and say, I want you to tell me the story now. And I would challenge some of what they said. Say, can you explain this statement or that you just said? And you would very quickly start to unravel the bits where it's, well, I'm guessing at this. Or maybe it wasn't so big. Yeah. Or, but I found personally as a journalist at that time that many media outlets, and I still see this very quickly, just completely accept what they're told. Whereas in any kind of crime or politics, you would never dream of doing that. You would challenge everything. You would research. You would dig in. But especially with coyotes, it's just very quickly, yep, that's what they are.
Well, and I think part of this might come back to this notion that, animals are different than people, or the people aren't animals, I guess. Yeah. And people are complex, and people are all different, and we have to acknowledge that they think and they feel and they get offended. And whereas when you're dealing with, this is my opinion or reflection on it, is that it's not a complex issue, right? So you wouldn't have to ask those questions that would really get at the nuts and bolts of what happened, because it's just simply you encountered an animal, and of course the description of what happened would be, what the person experiences. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there's a simplification of it, so a lack of understanding that every encounter with every animal is going to be different, and so therefore you might need to probe. And people don't understand. Every person doesn't understand coyote behavior, and every journalist doesn't understand coyote behavior. And so getting at the essence of what actually happened is overlooked, right?
Well, and I think that's very accurate. Again, when we're talking about a journalist's perception, one that would come up a lot, and I'm sure you've seen this too in the media, someone say the coyote was bold. And this is something I've since written about regularly for the Fur Bears. And I often cite your work. I cite your work a lot. I should probably give you some money or something, but
as long as it's doing good for the coyotes, that's the main thing.
I've got you recorded saying that, so now I owe you nothing. But no, one that comes up frequently is people say it's bold behavior, and it's when a coyote stops and watches and doesn't run away, even if you yell or raise your arms. And they can't fathom that coyote doesn't see you as a threat from 50 yards away. And that's one that I constantly come up against. And journalists accept it and promote that concept of it's a bold coyote. And all of a sudden that becomes the headline.
And it's tricky, right? And and I think part of the issue is around the practice of journalism and the need to be sensational, and and journalists aren't always to blame, right? It's you might write a balanced piece and then the editor wants to make it more volatile so it grabs attention, and we all get that. And so part of it then is educating people to actually understand what they're looking at. I think part of the issue here too is that when a coyote does behave that way, it may be that at about 50 meters or so, a coyote doesn't perceive you as an issue. But then maybe when you get to be 10 meters away or something, in circumstances where it's not habituated, that is abnormal behavior for it not to move away. And so there's a limit to the language that we have to describe that. And so we tend to gravitate to those words that just easily come to that. And I'm not sure that we have the appropriate language to talk about that without having too many words in there.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very fair and valid point in that. And I remember I was actually talking about this with Leslie Sampson, Coyote Watch Canada. You obviously know, and our audience probably knows by now too. But we were talking about it, and some reporter had said attack, right? It was a very common type story, and we were talking about it. And it was very clearly a defensive situation. Off-leash dog ran into the bush, coyote noises, and dog came running back. And they say that the coyote attacked the dog. And I said, but the journalist doesn't have the tools to describe this in any other way because they haven't been told that that's not an attack. Now, if it had been a bar fight and the witness was saying, well, this guy punched me out of nowhere, and you said you did nothing, said, well, no, I slapped him in the face first.
Yeah.
Then they know, okay, well, there was obviously more to this. But with a coyote, there's simply, there is no training. There's no knowledge of how that may impact the situation. And I think that's a very good way of putting it, as you said, is the language just doesn't exist for describing these extremely nuanced situations.
Yes, and normally, a coyote would take off. And I think Leslie would say, if a coyote is behaving in a way that's unusual, like coming within those really close distances, it's a barometer for something that people are doing in that area to have changed its behavior. The other, I was going to actually add to that was a description I've heard in my new research on the Foothills Coyote Initiative research is when the coyote actually runs away, because outside of the city they do actually flee. So even when I slow down my vehicle and it's about 100 to 150 meters away, if I slow down my vehicle, they'll bolt. So it's a very different behavior based on the coyote's experiences. Mm-hmm. But one of the things people described was they really feel uneasy when that animal turns and looks at them. And I found it fascinating because people found that to be an aggressive move, and really? And when that's how it was described by a few people as something to be concerned about because it stopped and now it's eyeing you up. When actually what's happening is the animal is actually stopping and eyeing you up and going, now am I far enough away from this person that they're no longer a threat to me? Yeah. So it's really interesting how, how those behaviors get spun almost always to we are on the defensive and they are always looking to come at us as opposed to they're just trying to get away from us, right?
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you've experienced this, and it's purely anecdotal, but I've been on, I think, 2 or 3 coyote releases from rehab, and every time coyote just bolts out of the crates, runs however far, and then stops dead and looks back.
That's exactly what I am.
Yeah, and for those of us who were involved in the rescue and rehab, well, for me it was mostly just the driving, but regardless, sort of in that moment of release, it's majestic to see. It's beautiful to see this animal all of a sudden return to the wild, looking back and saying, "Am I safe now?" Yeah. And it's very heartwarming, but at the same time, someone else sees that, and it's extremely unsettling. So that's really interesting how that context changes a very simple behavior.
Well, and that's some of what I'm trying to understand with the new research is why, like, what can you actually enter into that scenario and give particular pieces of information about coyotes that would help people understand that differently. Some people will be very resistant to that. They have a specific way of looking at things that's you're not going to change it just by telling them it's non-aggressive or telling them about behavior. But these are the kinds of things I think we need to continue to do research on, is to understand where are these misperceptions coming from, and how can we enter that system to help people see it differently, because it's always framed as coyotes trying to be aggressive towards us, even if it's, like you say, a defensive situation. For example, like the thing we're dealing with in Calgary right now, if you look at the photographic images just prior that was taken by the guy that was reportedly attacked, and he was bitten, according to the reports. Just prior to the attack, he's taking photos of this thing, and it's hackling, and its teeth are all barred, right? And it's clearly being antagonized.
Yeah.
But the person just says, "I was attacked," and like you say, nobody looks at the prior.
Well, and that's fascinating in dog circles, and a lot of our listeners are dog lovers. There's constantly videos going around of watch all of the signs this dog is showing. And I see it. I've got one dog, JJ, who tends to be reactive, and she's a bit of a jerk, and very protective of me. And she throws up gang signs constantly. And anyone who knows dogs, they see her and they're like, okay, I'm staying away from her. Right. Like, and this is, she's not aggressive. I make that very clear, but, she's very particular about certain things, around her space. And, you expect that. And we have sort of some kind of basic understanding of, okay, I see this dog. It's raising its hackles. It's putting its ears back. It's showing me the whites of its eyes. Its teeth are bared. It's pulling back its lips. It's doing all these things, turning sideways. And we say, okay, that dog doesn't like me. Yet we see that with a coyote. And all of a sudden, it just doesn't click. And that's to me, and really unusual that we have this disconnect. And that's, in fact, when I very first started reporting on coyotes, that was a piece of advice Mark Beckoff. Again, it's the same group of people over and over again in our circles. But, the piece of advice is think about dog behavior. What would you think if a dog was doing this? It's like, that dog is telling me to go away.
And so that's something that came up in a meeting or a presentation I was just involved with the other night, when I explained that coyotes are just dogs. So you have to think about the fact that you're training them to do specific things. So if if what you do is you continually feed it and it comes up and then it's your house and then it all of a sudden starts eating your carrots in your garden and you run at it and you sort of wave your arms in the air, what do you expect a dog is going to do in that situation? It's going to look at you and go, well, what kind of consequence is that, right? And they'll learn that, well, up to a certain distance, they're safe and they'll continue to do that. But the putting it into the context of our behavior is training coyotes to do specific things, and we can actually train them to do different things, or with some success, untrain some of those things. People were surprised; they hadn't thought about it in that sort of paradigm, right?
Well, and that's, I think we're talking about this Calgary situation, and right now, we were talking about this before I started recording. I had just gotten a notification through one of my services of a coyote story, and it's in Northwest Calgary. I'm guessing it was at some kind of trail system.
Yeah.
Has been partially blocked off because of the presence of coyotes. And as you say, someone came into conflict with coyotes. The interesting thing is the way this story is written. It's coyote closure expanded in Northwest Calgary, and it's relatively simple, but it starts out that it was blocked off because of the presence of coyotes. And then later explains that they are denning coyotes, but then switches back to the language of the animals had, I don't know, it's poorly written, probably an intern, a close encounter with a man and his daughter, and they needed to take action. Well, who needed to take action? It's written almost like when I was in high school and I thought I could be a novelist and I would write a scary scene. You know what I mean? Like, it's that kind of awkwardness. But then you read it and you go, okay, so there's coyotes denning and people are on that path.
Yeah.
We do this with bears all the time. We say, okay, for the next 3 weeks, don't go down this path.
I don't think we're there yet. So just like, I don't think people understood that the average person really understood dog behavior that well, or even still does today. I even see lots of dog owners who still don't seem to understand dog behavior. But so I think part of it is in the education, and part of it again is reframing it as we have no issue with doing that, or I shouldn't say we have no issue, but we understand doing that when we're dealing with something like a black bear. Or grizzly bear, like it's sort of become commonplace. And what I was happy to see within the review of this situation in Calgary was the one citizen who was interviewed used the word habituation. So it's almost like that language is becoming embedded and understood to some degree, right? That we are responsible for that. So that was really nice to see. I think the city's take on it probably. It got respun because the closure there is because of harassment of the den site leading to conflict with people. So the way it got spun out is unfortunate, because you don't get to the point of it being, or very directly, that the reason the closure has to happen is because people are harassing the den, not because the den is there, but they're intruding on the den and then refusing to accept the consequence. And I find it following up on that, I find it interesting because if you were to say, so I've been thinking about analogies for this, if you were to say to somebody, if you were to go into a complete stranger's house and you knew that they had a dog in there that was very protective of the house and you were to get bitten, would you find that unusual, right? So there just doesn't seem to be this understanding that you are trespassing into the private space of this animal. And I think it comes back to not understanding that the animals experience the world the same way we do, right? And that our expectations are a little bit wonky around that.
And just for everyone listening to know, I was nodding the whole time. I said, no, I realized afterwards, I'm like, wait, I'm only recording the sound on this. And my beard is simply not big enough to make that noise. But no, and that's absolutely right. And I'll often use that reference of a bar. Like if you walk into a bar and there's someone drinking a beer and you walk up and you poke them in the face.
Right. what do you think's going to
exactly.
happen?
Like you're creating this situation.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of the dogs, one of your other papers, you did a lot of really interesting and what I would consider to be almost sort of like expected research. So you did scat analysis. You reviewed the incidents of conflict and stuff. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, so I'm going to make them up because I'm a respectable journalist. And no, it was almost 100%. It was over 90% of the incidents. A dog was off leash when there was conflict.
Oh yeah.
And the other one was I want to say below 5% domestic dog and cat in the scats.
Okay, yeah, you're talking about two different papers there.
Okay.
So one, I want to be sure that the credit for the diet work goes to my master's student at the time, Victoria Lukasic, did all the diet work on the project, and then it was repeated.
You sent the intern out to play with poo, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and then it was repeated. It was repeated about 3 years later by a different student. But the paper you're referring to is the paper that came from Victoria's research, and Victoria's now a PhD student. So yes, and the diet. That study was really interesting because we set out to try to understand whether or not areas where there was lots of garbage or how much garbage was occurring where, and whether or not that was related to incidents of conflict. And so the pet content was very low. Of the 500 scats, I think it was 3 scats actually had pet remains in them, so pretty low as an overall, occurrence, and we thought that it would be much higher than that going into that. The other paper that you're talking about was also from the media content, and that was related to, just trying to understand the nature of conflicts that arose across Canada over a 12-year period between people and coyotes and pets. So dogs, which dogs were attacked under which circumstances, which ones survived, differences between small and large dogs and that. And yes, 97% of the cases that were reported in the media, if you actually looked at the facts that were presented, the person described the dog as having run away after the coyotes. So just like the situation you described at the very beginning of our interview, the dogs would take off, and then they would come back, but it would be reported as coyote attacks dog. And so then I went in separate steps from that to look at the bite patterning on the dogs that would be described. So I looked at whatever ones I could that actually reported the where the bites happened. And I went back to bite forensics and what do coyotes do when they are have a den invasion by another pack of coyotes. There's been some research done on that, and they could see that the type of wounding that was occurring on these medium and large sized dogs that had run after coyotes were territorial defense by the coyote. So the message out of that is if you know coyotes are around and you don't have good control over your dog, immediate recall, then you have to leash it in order to ensure safety, right?
Yeah.
We would not question that. If we walked out onto a busy road with our pet, we would take every step we could to make sure that it was protected and have it on the leash, right? But so it's just a matter of just shifting the mindset around that.
Well, and I was going to say, I'll often sit here in my city home and look out the window and see people walking their dogs off leash on a busy street, but you folks out west are kind of weird like that, so you'll take personal responsibility for things. No, and it is very true. Yeah. And I had a brilliant question lined up for you. Now it's gone. That happens sometimes. No, because I was visualizing. There's one guy who walks, and I'll see him walk around the corner, and then 10 seconds later, his dog come trotting behind him, and I'm just like, "Come on, dude, really?" Well,
yeah. I think the difference there would be if that dog got run over, that owner wouldn't be then that blame. I shouldn't say wouldn't be, but would probably be less likely to blame the driver of the car for running over the dog than they would if the dog was running behind and it got attacked by a coyote, or it ran off after chased a coyote and then got attacked by it. the responsibility, I think, even though that I have a feeling that they would view that differently. They'd be upset that their dog got run over, but they wouldn't necessarily say, we need to go out and kill all drivers of cars because obviously they need to be taken out, right? Like it just, as they would with coyotes.
I find it curious too when we talk about the language of some of this. We are very ready to sort of ascribe the attempted murder on these situations as sort of like, as we were saying, but if anyone's ever actually seen dogs fight now, and I don't mean the scuffs at the dog park, which we've all seen too, and that's
no
extreme, like, and it is hazardous and shouldn't be encouraged or allowed to sort of go on unnecessarily, but dogs can yell at each other with their jaws and their sounds and everything for 15, 20 seconds straight, and neither of them will have a scratch on them. And then dogs who want to hurt each other, it can take about 5.5 seconds before you start seeing blood. And I've always thought that the same would be true of coyotes. And as you say, you can see that when there are wounds, they've been defensive wounds, saying, go away, go away. I'm not trying to stop you. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to eat you.
That's the other part. It's not predatory. These aren't wounds that are targeted that I'm describing that are targeted for eating.
So how do we
killing.
Communicate some of this? And again, I mean, I feel like our opportunities can often be limited. For you in an academic session, you've got people who want to learn. For me, I've got people who are they want to protect animals and want to learn. But it's all of those other people that we really need to get some of this information out to. So how do we start trying to say that wasn't an attack, it was defensive, or he didn't want to necessarily hurt him or eat him, he just wanted to scare him away? How do we begin phasing these bits of sort of information in to try and, as you said, sort of get to that point with habituation where people are starting to understand that it's the environment that's created an issue and not the animal?
Well, I mean, it does come back to education, and I don't think education will work for everyone, and the research that I'm doing right now is looking at which types of people are sort of would be resistant to education. So there are people who are unlikely to, just the way they are in the world, they are unlikely to be pushed into different directions. But I think education is fundamental, and we need to use as many new ways of communicating that as possible. So whatever social media we can, I think all we can do is just, you have to just keep up the pressure, keep up the messaging. And the other key there is to find those analogs, right, that can bring it back so people go, oh, aha, right, okay, so that's what would happen if I did that to my dog, or that's what would happen if I walked into the bar, and then it's, and behaved in a certain way. And then it's, at the same time, trying to educate media somehow to start to probe into those. And I think last year, the Society of Conservation Biology conference in the U.S. had an entire section on media and media communication of science and that. So it's becoming more central that we need to work together on that. I mean, I have to say that over the last 5 years or so, 5 to 7 years, I've seen a big change in the way media, at least here, handles these particular situations. They actually are trying to get those other viewpoints. They're not just going for the attack. They seem to know that there's a bigger story that needs to be told, and there seems to be an empathy for the animals involved in the stories. And so I think I've seen that there's been positive change in that. And so, I think it's just, you have to continue on and not lose, it's easy to get burned out on trying to do that. And it's just also, I think, accepting small wins, right? Like, we're not going to change everybody on this overnight. I wish we could, but it's just not going to happen. But the other thing is getting into schools and educating kids on the language. It's something that I did I've done at elementary schools, and I put the image up of a coyote doing a specific thing, and I asked them to tell me what they see. And their language is so free, right? Oh, it's beautiful. Oh, it's ugly. It's whatever. But instead of just being like, it's terrifying, it looks like it's going to attack. Like, it's not, they've not lost the ability to see it. And so I like to use those venues to try to change the language or help them acquire language that empowers them to see it differently. Yeah.
Well, I really like that you said they haven't lost the ability to see it. And I think that's probably a key point, is as we age, we are besieged by stereotypes and tropes and concepts of our elders of society. And in some regions, they can be, very obviously aggressive against certain types of wildlife. There's a great example. Defenders of Wildlife wrapped up their big study and published it with Suzanne Stone, I think, on coexistence. And they had the wolves in Idaho. And when they would go up to some of these ranchers and they would show them data saying, here's a tagged wolf returning to a dead site constantly, right, where they put their carcasses. And then look here, 200 yards away is your herd. So they were able to literally show them with physical evidence, sort of like the step by step how this happened. And the thing I found very interesting about that is in that area with wolves, it's people who for generations have had no wolves on the landscape and all of a sudden have them. So all they know are the old stories. And I think in some of our urban areas in particular, we are starting to see more wildlife just due to, climate change and development and all that kind of stuff.
And more people and getting more people wandering around outside encountering
Absolutely.
more, right?
So the same thing starts to
we
happen.
Need stories.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. We need new storylines that people can grab onto and understand. So if you go back to where did they first learn about coyote, if it's Roadrunner and, or whatever coyote, then they have a very particular framework on that. If they've grown up, and some of my Foothills Coyote initiative is trying to untangle some of these questions of, what are those grounding stories that, or experiences that lead to the way that people behave now. And there's a very clear connection to, what they experienced as youth and who taught them differently.
And it's very challenging it's very difficult to challenge oneself and your own beliefs and thoughts. And that's something on a totally unrelated topic with my mental health podcast, Everyday Fray. I am talking a lot about and I'm learning a lot about is sort of as this new information is presented and you're going back, 30, 40, 50 years through your life and saying, okay, the reason I think this today is because, when I was 8, someone told me that, and how that then affected everything going forward. And that's for like personal insight and personal growth and personal health. Now imagine someone comes along and says, see that animal over there? You need to do that same work with them. Like it's intimidating, I would think.
Well, it is also, most people are unlikely to really interrogate that because they've internalized these belief systems around how ecosystems work and the storyline about what you must do. So going back and rewiring these, actually, it's deeper than just saying you need to change your comprehension of coyote. It's you need to change your entire orientation of yourself to other animals. And the environment, and so it's large, right, and threatening because it has become a personal way of being in the world and way of understanding the world. When someone comes in and tells you that you're wrong, it becomes a personal attack, right? And so that's what I'm trying to understand right now with the new research is which of these types of constructs or ways that people have learned to engage with the world are we potentially going to have any traction with by going back and asking them to do exactly that. And there are some, if you look at the climate literature, there are some people who are simply, no matter what scientific fact you throw at them, they are not going to respond and renegotiate, right?
Yep. And that's, it is both profound and upsetting and all kinds of things, but I think it's also very valuable for advocates, for educators to recognize that you're not saying, here's the one thing that's going to change your mind. It's recognizing that it's decades of knowledge and growth that you're trying to undo, and you can't do it overnight, like you've said. And especially in areas where we're talking coyotes, we're talking ecosystems, and you look at and I'm still trying to find an expert on this, the North American Wildlife Model of Conservation Model.
Yes.
And the entire foundation of that, and this is sort of the baseline for almost all conservation programs across our country in the United States, is that wildlife are a resource and should be used.
Well, and
that is one of the building blocks of it.
Yes, and so that really influences a lot of. I think there are several things that influence what we see now in the landscape, and the North American model for wildlife conservation is one of them. So there's a paper by Nelson et al. On that, and the part of the issue there was that the original model was developed at a time of complete resource depletion. And so in order to reestablish any kind of prey that was available for people to use, their only mechanism was to kill predators. And that became embedded as, well, this is what we do. This is how it's top-down control. And then the underlying assumption there is that we actually need to be maintaining prey like deer and moose and elk, specifically, like you say, as a resource for us to use, and the competitors for that are obviously predators. So the science has changed so much since then in understanding that the systems will actually control themselves. We don't need to be in there controlling. And that certainly became part of the understanding of what we should be doing on the landscape. It's a hangover. Right? There's still lots of people who've described to me that this is just what you need to do. You need to control them because they can't control themselves, and it's all grounded in that model. Well,
I think the other part. Well, yeah. Well, I think the other part of that too is that we look at this from our lifetime perspective, and nature looks at it from a perspective I don't think our minds could mathematically fathom. This,
correct.
Like we're a speck on a speck of dust floating through space, right? Like, to try and say, well, we need to manage the coyote population in Northwest Calgary.
I like to think I'm a speck.
You're a very shiny speck.
Speck on a speck on a speck. Yeah, on a shiny pink speck.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Anyway.
No, but when we start talking, Northwest Calgary, looking at the single den site, like it's hard to remember that it took billions of chances and years and evolution and adaptation and change to get to the point that there is this den site, and we think we can manage it just like an off-on switch. So that's almost a philosophical it's been a
philosophical
thank you
question.
Yes.
Well, we don't have the models for comprehending that scale, right? And we don't know. Most people aren't aware how long something like coyote has been on the landscape, 1 million years in North America, becoming what it is, and then therefore that drives why it's so able to live anywhere and then get into trouble, right? Most of us can't, and most can't think on that kind of scale. But we don't have the models. We're really, I think, and the education is changing now, but we're sort of taught to think in these smaller increments. Our whole economic system is based on these very much shorter time cycles, right? So
just look at Y2K. I think that's a perfect example. No one ever thought that we might need to count past 1999. Now, I think to wrap up, like, I mean, we've kind of gone off track a little bit from how the media writes about coyotes to you being a pink speck on a speck on a speck floating through space, and the philosophy behind evolution and adaptation. But when we talk about this, you and I, we've stood next to each other at conferences. We've talked about this before. We've both been interviewed, and I always walk away wondering, like, could I have done more? Could I have said more? And at the end of the day, I find we're constantly repeating ourselves, even as we learn more. What do you see in the next few years in terms of our ability to maybe finally get through to greater audiences or to larger sort of sets of principles in terms of how we view coyotes and how we view ecosystems? Is this something that is achievable for us?
I mean, it depends what are we going to reach a perfect world where nobody is killing any coyotes? I think that's a long ways off, but I think I teach a class in animal geography, and if there's any hope, it's in watching what happens when these students come in at the beginning and go through the course, and they learn about human-animal relationships, and I see the hunger to understand these things. The compassion is I think palpable. A lot of them want to do something different. I think many of them have been flooded through their lives with the current generation with things like Animal Planet or other media, social media sources that have exposed a lot of these, situations that people aren't really comfortable with, things we want to change. And so there's a real hunger for it. And I certainly noticed through the class, a lot of them changed their perspective. They report to me they've changed their perspective on animals as well. So those that come in with really no real thinking about it with the education change. And so I think when we look at that appetite, and then we look at the number of ways that we can outreach through social media sources, the connection of animals and meaning to whether it's economics, and I don't mean like using animals to sell products, but I mean, I've had examples here where certain companies want to add value added. They give their clients access to a blog, and they push out messaging on cool wildlife research that's going on in their city, right? And so I think there's all these other venues that we can tap into, and there's a desire to do things differently. And so I'm optimistic in that in that way that things will move, but at the same time, there are lots of sectors of society, the various societies that I'm encountering that, leave me, pretty disenchanted. But on balance, I feel like we are on the verge of paradigm shifts around how we treat other animals and our comprehension of it.
If you're interested in reviewing Shelley's work, I've posted a link you can follow on this week's Defender Radio blog at thefurbears.com. And I strongly encourage you writers and communicators to check out her media content analysis study for an eye-opening read. That's the show for this week, folks. For Defender Radio, I'm Michael Howie, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.